The smirk appeared before the words did. Victoria Hawthorne, Chief Executive of Hawthorne Technologies, and one of the most powerful women in American business, let her gaze drift across the glittering ballroom until it landed on a man standing quietly near the far wall. He was not doing anything wrong. He was not causing a scene. He was simply standing there, holding a glass of water instead of champagne, wearing a suit that had clearly seen better years, with shoes that bore the honest scuff marks of a life lived practically rather than for appearances. That was enough. That was more than enough. Victoria's lips curved upward in the particular way that powerful people sometimes allow themselves when they believe no one important is watching. She tilted her chin toward the man and murmured something to the colleague beside her, and a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small cluster of guests nearby. The man heard it. He always heard things like that. He simply chose not to react. "People like you don't belong here," Victoria said, not loudly, but loudly enough. The man's name was Daniel Carter. He was 38 years old, a father, a freelance technology consultant, and, as the entire room would discover within the next 40 minutes, the single most important private citizen in the country. He said nothing in response to Victoria's words. He only looked at her with patient, dark eyes, and waited for the evening to unfold the way it was always going to unfold. Outside, a motorcade was already moving through the city streets. Daniel Carter had grown up in the kind of American town that people from larger cities describe as quiet when they mean forgotten. Millhaven, Ohio sat in a crease between two low hills about 60 miles southeast of Columbus, and its population had not grown meaningfully in 30 years. The hardware store on Main Street was the same hardware store that had been there when Daniel's father was a boy. The diner that served the best apple pie in the county still used the same recipe. It was the kind of place where people knew your name and also your business, which meant that when Sarah Carter died of a brain aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind a 34-year-old husband and a 4-year-old daughter named Lily, the whole town knew by noon. They brought casseroles. They sat with Daniel in his living room while Lily slept, not knowing what to say, which was fine because Daniel didn't need anyone to say anything. He needed to breathe. He needed to survive the first hour, and then the first day, and then the first week. He did all of those things, quietly and without drama, because that was the only way he knew how to do anything. 4 years had passed since that October. Lily was 8 now, smart and loud and fiercely fond of dinosaurs. And Daniel had rebuilt his life around her in the methodical, unsentimental way of a man who knows that grief is not a project you complete, but a weight you learn to carry without losing your stride. He worked from home, mostly. He consulted for small and mid-sized technology companies that needed someone to untangle infrastructure problems they didn't have the in-house expertise to solve. He was very good at it. He charged fairly, and he never oversold his services, and his clients referred him to other clients, because in the world of quiet competence, word travels fast among people who know what they're looking for. He did not have a flashy website. He did not post on industry forums under his real name. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that ran well because he maintained it himself, and he cooked dinner every night at 6 o'clock because Lily expected it, and routine was the scaffolding that held their small household together. The letter had arrived on a Wednesday, printed on heavy cream-colored paper, with the Hawthorne Technologies letterhead embossed in dark blue across the top. Daniel had read it twice, standing at the kitchen counter, then set it down, and finished making Lily's lunch before reading it a third time. The letter was a formal invitation to the 50th anniversary gala of Hawthorne Technologies, one of the country's largest and most influential technology conglomerates. The event was being held in Washington, D.C., at the Grand Continental Hotel. Black tie preferred. RSVP required. Daniel stared at the phrase black tie preferred for a long moment, then put the letter on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. His neighbor Marcus, who had worked in corporate sales for 20 years before retiring early and moving next door, came over that evening to help Daniel fix the back fence and ended up reading the letter over his shoulder. Marcus told him, with the particular authority of someone who has attended many such events, that he absolutely needed to buy a new suit, "You can't walk into the Grand Continental in that gray thing you wear to client calls," Marcus said. Daniel disagreed, gently but firmly. The gray suit was perfectly respectable. He had worn it to Sarah's funeral and to every important meeting since, and he did not believe that a new suit would change anything about the evening in any meaningful way. Marcus shook his head but let the matter drop. Because that was the kind of man Daniel was, not stubborn exactly, but settled, in the way of someone who has decided what matters and has very little patience for what doesn't. The drive to Columbus to catch his flight gave Daniel time to think, which he both needed and didn't need. The flat Ohio farmland slid past the windows of the truck in the gray morning light, fields turning slowly toward winter. And Daniel thought about Sarah. He thought about her the way he always did on days that should have been shared, not with grief sharp enough to cut, not anymore, but with the dull and permanent awareness of absence. The way you notice a missing tooth, not constantly but every time your tongue moves to where it used to be. She would have made him buy the new suit. She would have been excited about Washington. She would have packed Lily's overnight bag, with more precision than any overnight bag had ever been packed. And she would have called her sister 3 times on the drive to the airport to update her on Lily's schedule. Daniel smiled slightly at the thought, said nothing to the empty cab of the truck, and kept driving. The Grand Continental Hotel occupied half a city block in downtown Washington and had been hosting events of national significance since the 1920s. Its ballroom could seat 600 guests in the kind of comfort that reminded wealthy people why they had worked so hard to become wealthy people. The chandeliers alone were worth more than Daniel's house. He noticed this not with bitterness but with the same detached, technical interest he brought to most things. It was, from an engineering standpoint, an impressive chandelier. He checked his coat at the entrance and accepted a glass of water from a passing server and found a section of wall near the east side of the room where he could stand without being in anyone's way while he got his bearings. The room was extraordinary. There were senators and their spouses. There were technology executives from a dozen of the country's largest companies, wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. There were venture capitalists who had funded the platforms that now ran the infrastructure of daily American life. And there were lobbyists who had spent careers making sure that infrastructure remained in private hands. And there were 3 or 4 people whose names Daniel recognized from financial news as individuals worth more than the GDP of small nations. Everyone knew everyone else, or performed the knowing of everyone else with practiced ease. Voices rose and fell in the particular music of a room full of people who are accustomed to being the most important person in any given conversation. Daniel was not uncomfortable. That surprised him slightly. He had expected to feel out of place, and he did in the objective sense. He was clearly wearing a different category of garment than most of the room's occupants, and he did not have a portfolio of holdings or a LinkedIn profile that would have made sense to anyone who glanced at him. But discomfort requires a certain amount of investment in other people's opinions, and Daniel had spent 4 years developing a very clear sense of what he was and was not invested in. He watched the room with calm curiosity and thought about Lily, who was home with Marcus's wife Janet, and was almost certainly being allowed to stay up past her bedtime. A man in a charcoal blazer detached himself from a nearby group and approached Daniel with the particular expression of someone who cannot resolve an ambiguity and has decided to resolve it directly. He introduced himself as Richard Baines, a hedge fund manager out of New York. He asked, with the kind of politeness that barely conceals condescension, how Daniel had come to be at the event. Daniel told him he had received an invitation. Richard Baines looked at him with unconcealed skepticism. From whom? Daniel said he was not entirely sure, which was true. The invitation had been signed by the Hawthorne Technologies events office and had included his correct address and his correct name, and had passed every test of legitimacy he could apply to it. Richard Baines studied him for a moment longer, nodded slowly in the way of someone who has decided not to pursue a line of questioning he finds distasteful, and drifted back toward his group. Daniel watched him go without animosity and took a sip of water. The murmuring had started by then, not loudly, not aggressively, but he could sense it the way you sense a change in weather, a shift in the texture of the air around him, glances that lingered a half-second too long, conversations that paused when he moved nearby. Someone near the bar said something about security. Someone else asked whether the invitation list had been properly vetted. Daniel stood and let it wash over him and thought about the encryption problem he was currently solving for a logistics company in Cincinnati, running through the parameters in his head the way other people might hum a tune. Victoria Hawthorne had inherited the chairmanship of Hawthorne Technologies from her father 8 years ago, at the age of 28, and she had spent every one of those years since proving that the inheritance had been earned rather than simply received. She was brilliant in the specific, narrow way that institutional power rewards strategically sharp, relentlessly focused, and possessed of an absolute certainty about the relationship between outward success and inward worth that had served her extremely well in boardrooms and had served her considerably less well in the portions of her life that had nothing to do with boardrooms. She was 36 years old and had been named to every list worth being named to, and she stood at the center of this room in a black dress that had been designed for her specifically, accepting congratulations and returning them with the smooth, reflexive warmth of a person who has mastered the performance of warmth without always needing to feel it. She noticed Daniel Carter for the first time at 8:17 in the evening. He was standing in the east section of the ballroom, near the second pillar from the entrance, and he was not speaking to anyone. Victoria had excellent peripheral awareness. It was one of the skills that made her formidable, and the stillness of someone who is not networking in a room full of networkers registered immediately. She watched him for a moment from across the floor. The suit was wrong. The shoes were wrong. The posture, oddly, was not wrong. He was standing with a self-contained ease that was actually more natural than the performance of ease she saw from the men around her. But that, if anything, made her more suspicious rather than less. She did not understand his stillness. Things she did not understand bothered her. She asked the head of her security detail, quietly, whether the east section of the room had been properly screened. He assured her it had. She asked whether all invitations in that section had been verified at the door. He confirmed they had. Victoria looked at Daniel Carter again and felt something she would not have been able to name precisely if asked. Something between irritation and challenge. She excused herself from the group she was standing with and began moving across the ballroom floor. She introduced herself with her full name and title, which was not something she usually needed to do at her own events, but she said it with the specific emphasis that was meant to communicate scale and importance. Daniel told her his name. She asked which company he was with. He said he worked independently as a technology consultant. She asked the name of his firm. He explained he worked as a sole proprietor. Victoria's eyes moved once over his suit, his shoes, his glass of water, and came to rest on his face with an expression that did not bother to hide its conclusion. She asked, with a precision that was almost surgical, how someone in his position had come to receive an invitation to an event at this level. Daniel said he honestly wasn't certain who had submitted his name. Victoria said that seemed like something a person would typically know. Daniel agreed that it did, and said he had not been concerned enough about the question to pursue it. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her without apology or aggression, or the particular anxious eagerness that people usually showed when Victoria Hawthorne looked at them directly. It was that steadiness that pushed her over the edge. She turned slightly so that the group of guests closest to them, 8 or 9 people, including 2 senators, a tech billionaire, and several of the most prominent venture capitalists in the country, could hear her clearly. She asked Daniel, in a voice pitched to Carrie, what his annual revenue was. He declined to answer. She asked what his net worth was. He declined again. Politely, she asked whether he had ever run a company with more than 10 employees. He said he had not. Victoria let a beat of silence expand before she spoke the words that she would spend the rest of her life regretting. People like you don't belong here. The laugh that followed was not a roar. It was worse than a roar. It was a series of small, contained sounds, the chuckle of a senator, the brief smile of a billionaire, the knowing look traded between 2 venture capitalists, sounds that said not that they found her funny, but that they agreed with her, and that agreeing with her was the socially correct thing to do. 2 people near the back of the group raised their phones, the screens tilting upward in the practiced way of people who have decided that a moment is worth capturing. Daniel said nothing for 3 full seconds. When he spoke, His voice was even and clear and carried no performance of dignity. Because he was not performing it. I think, he said quietly, that a person's value has very little to do with the things you just mentioned. He looked at Victoria with the same patient, unhurried eyes he had been looking at her with since she arrived. But I understand why you'd see it differently. He took a sip of his water. Victoria opened her mouth, and then, from outside the building, came the sound first distant, then suddenly close of a motorcade. The change in the room was immediate and total. Security personnel who had been invisible became visible. Earpieces caught signals. The head of the hotel's events staff appeared from a side door and began moving quickly across the room. The soft, self-satisfied music of 600 networking conversations dropped away and was replaced by something quieter and more alert, the particular hush of people who have just been reminded that there is a category of importance to which they do not belong. Everyone in the ballroom, without being asked, stood up straighter. Victoria stepped away from Daniel. The sequence of embarrassment had not fully registered yet. She was operating on the executive's instinct to move toward the event and away from the distraction, and Daniel Carter was a distraction that could be managed later. She positioned herself near the entrance with her events director and adjusted the expression on her face to its most practiced version of gracious welcome. The heads of major tech companies did the same, arranging themselves in the unspoken hierarchy of wealth and influence, each one calculating their likely proximity to the arrival. The agents came first, spreading through the room with the practiced ease of people who have done this in larger and more complicated spaces. Then there was a shift near the entrance, a parting of the crowd, and the President of the United States walked into the Grand Continental Ballroom. He was taller in person than on television, which people always noted, and he moved with the particular quality that characterized him in public, not the performed confidence of a campaign stage, but something quieter, a settled authority that did not require the room's attention to exist. He shook hands with the event's hosts near the entrance. He acknowledged the chairwoman of the Senate Technology Committee. He exchanged brief words with the CEO of the country's largest semiconductor manufacturer. Victoria watched from her position near the center of the receiving area and felt the pull of the moment, the convergence of 50 years of her family's company history with the most significant guest who had ever attended one of its events. She was ready. She had prepared remarks. She had practiced the handshake. The president moved through the preliminary greetings and then paused. His eyes moved across the room in the way of someone who is looking for something specific in a space that has many things in it. His security detail stayed one step behind him. The room was absolutely silent. Victoria began to step forward. The president's gaze continued moving. It crossed the senators, crossed the billionaires, crossed the lobbyists, crossed Victoria herself, and kept moving. His eyes traveled to the east section of the room, to the second pillar from the entrance, and found Daniel Carter standing there exactly as he had been standing all evening, with his glass of water and his well-worn shoes and his patient, steady expression. The president's face changed. Not dramatically, it was a subtle thing. The softening of a mouth held professionally neutral. Something that looked, from a distance, very much like relief. He walked across the room. Every person in the ballroom watched him go. There was no polite conversation to return to, no glass to look into, no colleague to consult. The President of the United States was crossing the floor of the Grand Continental Ballroom, moving away from the senators and the billionaires and the woman who had spent 36 years building one of the most powerful technology companies in the country, and he was walking toward a man in a worn gray suit, standing quietly by the east wall. The silence in the room had the specific quality of a held breath, not panic, not confusion exactly, but the complete suspension of normal social functioning that occurs when something happens that no available framework can explain. Daniel saw him coming. He set his water glass down on the table beside him and stood with the same unhurried ease he had maintained all evening. But something shifted behind his eyes, not quite discomfort, but the private recognition of a man who has spent years hoping to be forgotten and understands that he has been found. The president stopped in front of him. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it, and the president held the handshake for a long moment longer than protocol required, with both hands, in the manner of a person who wants to communicate something that words will take a while to reach. "Daniel," the president said, and his voice carried clearly across the silent room because there was nothing else to carry. "I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this to you in person." He paused. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at something he has thought about for years without being able to acknowledge it. "Finally, I have the opportunity to thank you in front of this country." The cameras, news cameras, event cameras, the phones of 600 guests swung toward Daniel Carter like a field of sunflowers following the light. Victoria Hawthorne stood 12 feet away and felt the blood leave her face in a slow, steady tide. Daniel looked at the president and said, quietly, "Mr. President, that really isn't necessary." The president smiled, and it was not a political smile. "It really is," he said. "Will you come up to the stage with me?" Daniel looked at the stage. He looked at the room. He said nothing for a moment. And then he nodded, once, in the way of a man who understands that some moments cannot be declined. The room erupted not yet in full understanding, but in the instinctive response of people who recognize that they are witnessing something significant and do not want to be the last person to acknowledge it. The president stood at the podium on the stage of the Grand Continental Ballroom with Daniel Carter beside him, and he spoke without notes, which was unusual enough that the journalists in the room straightened immediately. He began by saying that he had debated with his team for weeks whether to make this evening the occasion for what he was about to share. He had ultimately decided that 50 years of Hawthorne Technologies was the right moment, because the story he was going to tell was, in its deepest sense, a story about American technology, what it could do, and who, unexpectedly, it came from. 4 years earlier, the president said, the country had faced a crisis that had never been made public. The Integrated Defense Communications Network that coordinated the country's strategic infrastructure, a system touching everything from power grid management to emergency response protocols to the secure communications backbone used by federal agencies, had been compromised. Not by a foreign government, which would have been difficult but manageable through established channels. It had been compromised by a cascade failure in its own architecture, a flaw so deeply embedded and so elegantly concealed that it had survived 7 years of routine audits without detection. When it finally surfaced, the engineers who discovered it estimated they had between 60 and 90 days before the degradation would become catastrophic. At that point, the exposure to the country's infrastructure would not be theoretical. It would be real, and it would be severe, and the economic damage alone, in terms of systems failure, of frozen financial networks, of disrupted logistics, would have been measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The damage to national security would have been harder to calculate and worse. The country's best technology teams had been brought in under complete classification. They worked for 3 weeks without meaningful progress. The problem was of a kind that standard approaches could not address. It required not just technical expertise but a specific and unusual way of thinking about systems architecture, a capacity for seeing the structure of a problem from the outside, rather than working through it layer by layer from within. The president's technology advisors had ultimately done what advisors do when conventional resources fail. They asked around, quietly, among people they trusted, for names they might not have thought of. A name came back more than once. It was a name that none of them recognized. It was Daniel Carter, of Millhaven, Ohio. Daniel had been contacted by a federal liaison and given, under strict confidentiality, a non-specific description of the problem, enough to understand its type, but not its specific parameters. Within 48 hours, he had sent back a preliminary analysis. The liaison called the president's chief technology advisor and said, with the controlled urgency of a person trying not to overstate things, that they should get this man in a room as soon as possible. Daniel had come to Washington with a single bag. He had asked for a workspace, a secure connection, and this was the detail the president included, with a warmth that brought laughter from the audience, a good coffee maker. He had been given all three. Over the following 6 weeks, working with a small team of government engineers who were there primarily to implement what he directed, Daniel Carter had built the patch architecture that sealed the cascade failure. Not a partial seal, not a containment, a complete, elegant, permanent solution that the reviewing engineers had described in their classified report as some of the most sophisticated systems work they had encountered in 30 years of practice. The hundreds of billions of dollars in potential damage had been prevented. The jobs tied to the systems that ran on that infrastructure. The president paused here to let the number register had been protected. The breach had been closed before it had been exploited by any external actor. The country had not known any of this had happened. The country had gone about its life, and the economy had continued to function, and the lights had stayed on, and the emergency systems had continued to respond. And the financial networks had continued to settle, and none of the people at this gala, or in any other room in America, had ever woken up to news about a crisis that had been building quietly in the architecture of the systems they depended on every day. When the work was done, the president said, his office had prepared a formal recognition package for Daniel Carter. A ceremony, a medal, a public announcement. Daniel had declined all of it. He had asked, through the liaison, for the work to remain classified and his involvement to remain private. He had said that he did not want public recognition, that he had done the work because it needed to be done, and that he would prefer to go home. He had been asked multiple times, through multiple channels, whether he would reconsider. He had not reconsidered. He had gone home to Millhaven, Ohio, and he had picked up his daughter from his neighbor's house, and he had made dinner at 6 o'clock, and he had gone back to consulting for small and mid-sized technology companies with infrastructure problems, and the country had never known his name. Until tonight, the president said. The room was standing. It had begun rising somewhere around the moment the president described the preliminary analysis Daniel had returned in 48 hours, and by the time he finished speaking, there was no one in the Grand Continental Ballroom still in their seat. The applause was not the polished, rhythmic applause of a political event. It was something rawer and more genuine, the sound of people responding to a story that had reached past their social programming and landed somewhere in the part of them that still believed in certain things about the country and about people. Daniel stood beside the president and looked at the floor for a long moment before he looked up. He had the expression of a man receiving something he does not feel he deserves, which was the expression of someone who had, in fact, deserved it completely and had simply never asked for it. The president reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a case. Inside the case was a medal, the Presidential Medal of Honor for Distinguished Private Service, a designation that had been created specifically for this occasion by executive order, because no existing category quite fit what Daniel had done. The president pinned it to the lapel of the gray suit that had looked so wrong in the ballroom 2 hours earlier, and the cameras caught it, and 600 people watched a worn lapel become something that would be in history books. Daniel was given the microphone. He held it for a moment before he spoke. And when he spoke, it was briefly, without rhetoric, in the plain and direct voice of someone who is not accustomed to stages and does not intend to become accustomed to them. I want to say something to my daughter Lily, he said, who is at home in Ohio right now, hopefully asleep and probably isn't. There was warm laughter. Lily, your mom would have been proud tonight. I know that. He stopped. He gathered himself with the visible effort of a private man choosing to share a private thing in public. And I want to say to everyone in this room, and I mean everyone, what happened 4 years ago wasn't about me. It was about the fact that there were a lot of people working on that problem. And some of them are people you've never heard of, and probably never will hear of. And they did extraordinary work. I just happened to find one piece of the puzzle. He paused. Nobody does anything that matters alone. I really believe that. He handed the microphone back to the president and stepped back from the podium, and the room erupted again. The senator from Virginia found Daniel first when he stepped down from the stage, then the CEO of the largest semiconductor company in America, then 3 venture capitalists who had been competing for introductions all evening. The head of Hawthorne Technologies' main government contracting division appeared at his elbow with a business card. Daniel accepted greetings with gracious brevity and moved through the crowd with the slightly overwhelmed composure of someone who is managing an experience they had not planned for. and are managing it the best way they know how, which is with honesty and with patience. He did not look for Victoria. He did not need to. He was not thinking about her. He was thinking about Lily and about the drive home, and about whether Janet would have remembered that Lily was not supposed to have more than 1 cup of hot cocoa before bed. Victoria Hawthorne stood where she had been standing for the past 40 minutes, near the east wall of the room, and she did not move toward the crowd surrounding Daniel, and she did not speak to anyone. She felt, and it was not a feeling she had vocabulary for because she had not felt it in a very long time, ashamed. Not the surface-level embarrassment of a social miscalculation, not the professional discomfort of having misread a situation, something older and deeper and less manageable than either of those things. She replayed her own words in the acoustic chamber of her memory, with the merciless precision that memory brings to things we would most like to forget. People like you don't belong here. She thought about the way she had said it, the way she had turned toward the group to make sure they heard. The calculation in it, not just rudeness, but a performance of rudeness, a deliberate use of an audience to amplify a humiliation. She had done it because she could. She had done it because in her framework of the world, the man in the worn suit with the quiet eyes represented a category of person that she had decided, at some point in her education in power, did not need to be taken seriously. She had been building that framework her entire adult life, one successful quarter at a time. And she had been so proud of it. She stood in the beautiful ballroom of the hotel that her family's company had paid for, and she felt the framework come apart in real time, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow and irreversible way that things come apart when the evidence against them becomes impossible to absorb. She found him 20 minutes later, when the initial wave of well-wishers had receded slightly, and Daniel was standing near the exit holding his jacket over his arm, clearly preparing to leave. She walked toward him with the particular deliberateness of someone who is doing something difficult and knows that the doing of it will not be made easier by delaying it. Daniel. He turned. He looked at her without coldness, without the satisfaction that would have been understandable and that she would have deserved. He simply looked at her and waited. Victoria had prepared something to say, had been composing it internally for the past 20 minutes, and when she opened her mouth it fell apart completely, and what came out instead was simpler and less polished, and, for that reason, more true. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said earlier was it was wrong, and it was cruel, and I am genuinely sorry." She stopped. She held his gaze. She did not try to explain or contextualize or manage. She had done enough managing for one evening. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He did not tell her it was fine, because it had not been fine. He did not perform forgiveness with the easy generosity of a man who wants to be admired for his magnanimity. He said, "Thank you for saying that." And then he said, with the same quiet directness he brought to everything, "I think you know what you're actually apologizing for. It's not just what you said to me." Victoria felt the truth of this land, with the specific accuracy of something aimed precisely. She nodded. She did know. "The company you've built," Daniel said, "could do a lot of good. There are people worth finding who never get found because they don't look the part. You have the resources to change that." He said it without accusation, simply as a fact he had observed, which was more devastating than any accusation would have been. Then he said, "I hope Hawthorne Technologies has a good next 50 years, and he meant it, and somehow that made it worse, and somehow that was also the most helpful thing anyone had said to Victoria Hawthorne in a very long time. He was nearly at the coat check when the president's chief of staff touched his elbow and asked if he had a moment. Daniel said he had a moment, and was led to a quiet anteroom off the main corridor, where the president was sitting with his jacket off, drinking a glass of water, with the particular relief of a man who has been in a public room for 2 hours and has briefly escaped it. He gestured for Daniel to sit. They talked for 20 minutes, and no record of the conversation was kept because the chief of staff was not present, and Daniel would not discuss it later. What is known is that Daniel left the anteroom with an offer that he did not accept that evening, and a standing invitation to a conversation about a role in a new interagency technology resilience initiative that the administration was quietly building. He told the president he would think about it. The president said that was all he asked. They shook hands again, and Daniel retrieved his coat and walked out of the Grand Continental Hotel into the Washington night. The air was cool and clean. The street outside the hotel was lit by the ordinary lights of an ordinary city, headlights, street lamps, the lit windows of buildings where people were doing ordinary things. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a moment and took a breath. His phone showed a message from Janet saying that Lily had in fact been awake until 10:30 and had asked 11 times whether her father would call before she went to sleep, and had finally accepted the compromise of falling asleep with her dinosaur book on her chest and her bedroom light still on. Daniel looked at the message for a long time, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when he thought about Lily, not quite a smile, something warmer and less expressible than a smile, and he typed back a thank you that included 3 heart emojis, which was 2 more heart emojis than he typically used. He was going home in the morning. He had a client call at 2 in the afternoon. A logistics company in Cincinnati that had a data integrity problem he was about 70% of the way through solving. He had a dentist appointment for Lily on Thursday. He had a parent-teacher conference on Friday, and Marcus had already agreed to pick Lily up from school. These were the coordinates of his life, and they were enough, and he was, in the way of someone who has learned the difference between happiness and the idea of happiness, content. Victoria Hawthorne did not sleep that night. She sat in the suite the hotel had prepared for her, in the chair by the window, with the lights of Washington spreading out below her, and she thought about the way she had built her understanding of success. She thought about the frameworks she had inherited, and the ones she had constructed herself, and the degree to which they had served her, and the degree to which she had used them as permission to stop looking at people carefully. She was not, she told herself, a bad person. She genuinely believed that. But she had spent so many years optimizing for a particular kind of outcome that she had let a kind of blindness develop, the blindness of efficiency, the way you stop seeing the details of a road you drive every day because your brain has categorized it as known and moved on to something more interesting. People had become categories. Categories had become irrelevant or relevant based on the metrics she had decided to use, and the metrics she had decided to use were the metrics that had always served Victoria Hawthorne, which meant they were not, actually, metrics for measuring people. They were metrics for measuring proximity to her own success. Daniel Carter had stood in her ballroom in a worn gray suit and been the most important person in the room, not because of the medal, not because of what the president had said, but because of what he had done 4 years ago, with no thought of being the most important person in any room ever again. He had solved the problem because the problem needed to be solved. He had gone home because home was where he needed to be. He had raised his daughter and made dinner at 6 o'clock and worked quietly at something he was extraordinarily good at. And he had not needed Victoria Hawthorne or anyone like her to tell him that he belonged somewhere, because he had never organized his sense of himself around belonging in rooms like this. She called her chief of staff at 6:30 in the morning. She told him she wanted to schedule a full leadership review before the end of the month. She told him she had been thinking about the company's approach to talent acquisition, and she wanted to look specifically at what the company might be missing, not candidates from top-tier schools, not candidates with the right resume architecture, but people doing extraordinary things in places that Hawthorne Technologies had never thought to look. Her chief of staff said that sounded like an interesting initiative and asked what had prompted it. Victoria said she'd had an educational evening. She did not elaborate. The program that resulted from that call, a talent identification initiative that specifically sought out independent consultants, self-taught engineers, and technical problem solvers working outside conventional institutional structures, was announced the following spring. It was funded with a commitment of $40 million over 5 years. The press covered it as an unusual move for a company of Hawthorne Technologies' stature. Victoria declined to explain the personal origin of the initiative in any of the interviews she gave about it, because some debts, she had decided, are paid forward rather than explained, and some lessons are more useful when they remain between the people involved. The president's closing remarks at the gala, delivered after Daniel had already left the room, were broadcast widely and quoted frequently in the months that followed. He spoke about the country's relationship with its own genius, the tendency, he said, to look for capability in the places where capability was expected to be found, and to miss it systematically in the places where it had developed without institutional support, without credentials, without the visible markers that institutions use to identify each other. He said that the most significant contributions to the country's security, to its economy, to its culture, had often come from people who would not have passed the first screen of any conventional talent process. He said that the work of a nation that wanted to remain genuinely exceptional was to build the humility to find those people, and the wisdom to recognize them when they appeared, even when they appeared in a worn gray suit, at a gala full of people who hadn't yet learned to look past the suit. The greatest contributions to a society, he said, almost always come from the people who were never asking for credit. He did not mention Daniel Carter by name in this section of the remarks. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. And many of them, in the weeks and months that followed, found themselves thinking back to the moment that a man with a glass of water and no business cards had stood quietly against a wall while a roomful of important people failed to understand that he was the reason some of the most important systems in their lives were still running. Daniel Carter drove back through Ohio on a gray Saturday morning in November, with Lily in the back seat, asking increasingly specific questions about the Cretaceous period and whether, if a T. Rex and a Triceratops had a fight, the T. Rex would always win, or only sometimes win. He told her that paleontologists believed the Triceratops had a pretty strong defensive advantage, and that the outcome would probably depend significantly on the specific circumstances. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom dinosaur combat scenarios are a subject of genuine intellectual weight. And then said she thought the Triceratops would win, and Daniel said he thought she might be right. The medal was in a case in his bag. He hadn't decided where to put it at home yet, probably somewhere quiet. Lily didn't know it existed yet, and when he told her he would tell her the truth, that he had helped fix something that needed fixing, and that sometimes that was what the most important work looked like from the outside. He hoped she would remember that. He hoped she would grow up understanding that the value of a thing you do is not the same as the attention it receives, that the quietest work is sometimes the work that holds everything else together, and that the kind of person worth being is not the kind of person who arranges their life to be seen, but the kind of person who shows up when they're needed and goes home when the work is done. The Ohio countryside came back around them, familiar and gray and honest. Lily fell asleep somewhere around Columbus, her head tipped against the window, the dinosaur book open in her lap. Daniel drove in the comfortable silence of a man who has nothing left to prove, on a road he knew well, toward a home that was ordinary and entirely his. Outside the Grand Continental Hotel, still framed in its lit windows, the event was officially concluded. The caterers were clearing the last of the tables. The chandeliers that cost more than Daniel's house were being dimmed by the facilities staff, one circuit at a time. 600 guests were moving into Washington nights of varying significance, each of them carrying a version of the evening forward into whatever came next. Some of them would forget most of it within a week. Some of them would remember the applause for years. A few of them, the ones who had been standing close enough to see Daniel Carter's face when the president walked across the room, would find themselves thinking about it at unexpected moments for the rest of their lives. The moment when a room full of the most important people in the country went silent, and the man who had kept the lights on looked at the floor and accepted a medal he had tried to avoid, and said it wasn't really about him. He was wrong about that, of course. It was, in every sense that mattered, entirely about him. It was about the fact that he had done the work without needing anyone to know. It was about the fact that he had raised his daughter and made dinner and driven a truck that ran because he maintained it. It was about the worn suit and the glass of water and the patience with which he had stood in a room full of people who thought they understood value and waited, without bitterness, for the truth to take care of itself. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not post a statement. It does not require witnesses or ceremonies or the approval of people who have decided they are the arbiters of what matters. It is the courage of a man who loses the person he loves most and gets up the next morning and makes breakfast. It is the courage of a person who is publicly humiliated in a room full of powerful people and does not flinch, not because they feel nothing, but because they have decided long ago that their sense of themselves is not negotiable. It is the courage of a person who does the hardest work of their life and then goes home, because home is real and worth returning to. And because the work was never about the recognition, it was always only about the work. Daniel Carter had that kind of courage. He had built it the slow way, through the ordinary years of a life that had not been easy, and had not been glamorous, and had not been anything other than genuinely, deeply his. And it had been, in the end, the most valuable thing in any room he had ever stood in. It always had. It still would. The applause behind him had long since faded by the time his truck turned onto the county road. The metal sat quiet in its case. Lily slept with her dinosaur book. The fields rolled past in the November gray, and in the way of things that are real, things that do not require an audience to exist, things that hold their shape long after the chandeliers are dimmed and the last important person has gone home, it kept going.